Welcome back viewers, ladies, gentlemen, non-binaries and anyone with ears or other sound detection organs. Hope you enjoy. We are continuing with Going Native, written by Uncle Sealing. Going Native, Chapter 71. Walking on the unnaturally smooth floors that the people of the stars, the Shilvati, preferred was always aggravating. The texture pads on Hurultai's feet, covered in grooves that split into smaller grooves that split into the finest of hairs, provided ample grip on any surface. On these strangely smooth floors, they provided perhaps too much. Just walking involved peeling her feet off the ground step by step. Behind her, she could hear the patter of another dozen of Hurul, even the softer sounds of Hurul himself. Hurultai was proud to be walking where she was. In the months since the people of the stars had made their presence known, life had improved greatly for both the people of the lands and the people of the seas. It had been rough going at first. The dishonours casually bestowed on her people by the Shilvati were numerous and bloodshed had been commonplace. Things had finally calmed down, though it took a great deal of time. One of the star people, Chelsodemir, had come to stay with all of Hurul. The nest was elated when Chelsodemir had taken the time to learn their ways, timidly and submissively explaining how the bizarre culture of the Shilvati people worked. They had no honour, neither personal nor the greater honour of the father. Instead they had an interlocking web of promises and bribes and coercion. It was backwards and primitive, but despite their handicaps the star people had conquered everything. At least, that was their claim. Now, finally, it was time for Hurultai and all the rest of Hurul to meet their leader, the one called Elent Governess. It was a title, which was still odd to Hurultai. If you used a job as a name, it just became a name. Still, she was in the nest of the Shilvati and so she must abide by the Shilvati ways. The most important of these ways had been explained again and again by Chelsodemir. It was difficult at first for Hurultai to comprehend, but once the understanding existed she was able to spread it to the rest of the people. The Shilvati were children. They had a hatchling's sense of honour, and so should be spared, instructed in the ways of their foolishness. Incidents of violence had dropped, though occasionally a father's honour was spat upon. Then violence was the only answer. Father's honour was what brought Hurultai to see Elent Governess today. The Shilvati had wished to see a male and wanted to present offerings to Hurul as the heart of a great nest. Chelsodemir had smoothed the way as best she could, had prepared them for the casual insults that might escape the lips of Elent Governess. They had been disarmed before approaching the throne, of course. Already this place was filled with the stink of insult. Hurultai rotated her eyes independently, examining the guards in their golden armour, the golden ceiling tiles, the golden tapestries, the real guards, hiding behind those tapestries. It was a lavish display of wealth that only spoke of greed and a smallness of character. The woman on the throne's voice was harsh and guttural, lacking the soft smoothness of the speech of the people. Her false words were translated, and the true words of the people came forth from a small box nearby. You are Hurul, yes. I am Hurultai. Already the insults began. She would not put herself before the father name of her nest. To name her as such was to accuse her of the worst sort of pride. I see you have brought your male with you along with the rest of your family. I have always wanted to see what they looked like. He is pretty. Hurultai nodded. This was true. Hurul was one of the most attractive of all males. The colours of his neck frills were vibrant, making his virility and good health clear. What do you call him? I am Hurultai, so he is Hurul. To say otherwise is to claim we have stolen him. Careful, Hurultai. Remember, this is one of the star people. They are children in the ways of honour. Her question meant no insult, it was simply a lack of understanding. Elent Governess nodded. An interesting naming convention to be sure. Tell me, how does one acquire a male like yours? Through bravery and honour. Ah yes, your precious honour. Chilza wouldn't shut up about that. Thankfully, she seems to have managed to break you of that violent streak. Hurultai's hand twitched, but there was no weapon nearby. The insult must be intentional. If Chilzadamir, who had come to understand them so well, had explained the ways of the people to Elent governess, then there was no misunderstanding. This was not a child in the ways of honor. Hurultai puffed out her throat sac slowly, letting the mucus begin to collect. Perhaps this idiot would not understand. Oh, did that upset you? It's all right, Tai. Once you become full members of the Shilvati Empire, you won't have to worry about your backwards ways. We will give you a better sort of honor, just like we have given you electricity and steel. Hurultai's head frill unfolded as she fully inflated her throat sac, her venom glands injecting the complex cocktail of enzymes and corrosives into the center of the knot of mucus. As the venom from each gland mixed, they came into full potency. The only thing protecting Hurultai from an abrupt suicide was the thin protective balloon of the mucus. Wow, I must really have offended you. Look at that adorable threat display, all puffed out at me. Clearly she means to do me harm. Guards, take them all away for threatening the governess. Leave the male, I think I could have some fun with him. A final insult, a direct threat to the nest's father. Hurultai's eyes swung forward, each focusing independently, calculating distance. A quick inhale through her nose slits filled her lungs, not for breathing but to be the propellant for what she knew would be her final action. With a quick burst of air, the fist-sized ball left her throat, shaped by pliable lips. It hardened during its 10-meter journey, holding shape until it could shatter like a glass bottle directly in Elent governess's face. Let her suffer the greatest insult for the greatest dishonor. Hurultai succumbed willingly to the weapons fire of the guards. She had given her statement of defiance. As Hurultai's laser-riddled body hit the floor, one eye was watching as all of Hurul Nest, died. The other watched a screaming woman from the stars try to pull the mucus off her face, only to find that skin and bone were coming off with it. Elent governess's death screams were wet as the Shilvati's lungs filled with blood, her body already starting to be eaten away from the inside, the horrible enzymes doing their duty. Hurul would die with honor. This is a Nixian. Jemsai tapped his omnipod and the wall screen lit up. The image was a crowded street scene, but focused on one sapient in particular. She was tall like a Shilvati female but rail-thin. Her skin was a mottled green, the color of moss. Stace decided to start at her feet and work his way up. The feet were broad and splayed, each of the 4 digits ending in a rounded pad like a gecko or a tree frog. Long legs showed cord muscle. Stace's eyes nervously skipped over what might be a cloaca or a ahem. She was wearing a belt covered in pouches and complete with a pair of long knives, one on each hip. No other clothing except for small pieces of jewelry here or there. A long tail hung behind, tapering to a blunt point. It was curled into a tight spiral, keeping it off the ground. Small breasts, barely more than bumps with small nipples, might not have been noticed except that the belly and chest coloration, a pale khaki, seemed to accent them, the color wrapping around each breast. The arms were long and narrow, each ending in a 4-fingered hand. A thumb opposed by 2 fingers and one sort of strength finger? Sort of like if you fused your pinky and ring fingers, then beefed the resulting digit up a bit. Stace really didn't have a word for it. The head was interesting. The mouth was large but featured full lips, nostrils simply vertical slits. The eyes were large, very large, iridescent blue orbs with circular pupils. They also appeared to be able to move independently. The subject of the picture was looking in 2 completely different directions, pupils even different sizes. Impressive. Her ears were longer than a human or Shilvati's, coming to narrow points. The edges looked ragged, but their way to tell if that was natural or some sort of body modification. No hair, but a narrow flap of skin seemed to be folded back across the top of the head. The average female-to-male ratio in the galaxy is about 8 to 1. On Nyx, a female lays a clutch of between 12 and 20 eggs. Following the laying, a second. Jem'Hsai took a moment to blush. Coupling results in a single smaller egg being laid. The first clutch is always female and the second is always male. Stace found himself starting to tune out on the conversation, focusing on the picture on the screen. He had seen aliens, even loved them, but he had never seen something like this. Sapient creatures utterly different from him, yet clearly living their own lives. Behind the Nixian, centered in the photograph, he could see crowds of living, breathing individuals, a bustling town or small city. There were smaller ones, children, scampering about. Some of the smaller ones even seemed to be climbing the walls of the buildings in the background. It was a vibrant scene of a wholly different world. He had to know more. Jem'Hsai took a moment to take a sip of his drink and steady his nerves. He wasn't looking forward to explaining this, but it had to be done. Everyone here deserved to know why they were fighting. Everything I am about to tell you is classified. None of it is public. Even most other noble houses are not aware of what happened. About 100 years before the Shilvati Empire found humanity, we found Nyx. Their civilization was coming into the start of an industrial age, limited in part by a lack of easily accessible iron deposits. Because their system is in a very awkward location between the Imperium and some of the Alliance worlds, and there was nothing particularly enticing there from a commercial standpoint, it was decided that we would make contact privately, handle it gently, then make Nyx known to the greater Imperium and the galaxy at large once we were well established there. So kind of the opposite of how Earth was handled. Samuel's voice was more sad than angry. Jem'Hsai could understand the feeling. The more he got to know the humans, the more certain he was that orbital strikes followed by overwhelming military supremacy was pretty much the worst thing the Imperium could have done to make humans into allies. It was making House Chelsea's job extremely difficult. Considering the low level of technology on Nyx, there was no need for a major military response. Governess Lely Alent was given overall command of the operation. I am not going to dig into the politics too deeply, but this was a great honor for House Alent. Successfully incorporating a new species into the Imperium is a boon to any house with ambitions, and Alent is definitely ambitious. At first, House Chelsea had no presence on the planet. Unfortunately, Governess Alent was not able to handle the Nixians on her own, and so Demir Chelsea was sent to serve as a mediator, to learn their ways and how best to break the Nixians so they could become productive members of the Imperium. Jem'Hsai tried to keep his face neutral, his voice calm, but he was sure his audience could hear the bitterness there. In many ways, he looked up to Demir. The curse of House Chelsea had hit her perhaps hardest of all, and she gave in to it. The curse had killed her as much as House Alent had. The trouble with Nixian culture is their concept of honor. Each Nixian carries their personal honor as well as the honor of the father, which is the honor of the male in their nest, since he is the father of the children. To insult either honor is often a death sentence, settled with those long knives they all carry. Few if any female Nixians live to an old age. In fact, if you remove children and the youngest adults from the equation, their gender ratio drops to about 4 to 1. Most of those deaths are due to perceived insults to honor or an attempt to gain status through a duel. It leads to a sort of instinctive politeness brought on by the knowledge that speaking poorly can get you killed. What Governess Alent wanted House Chelsea to do was to somehow break them out of that cultural dependence on honor and bring their sensibilities more in line with the Imperium as a whole. Stace chimed in then. It startled Jem'Hsai, he had completely forgotten the quiet man was there. Sounds pretty much impossible. At least in the short term. That's what Demir Chelsea said. She felt that the only way to do it properly was to show them the Shilvati lifestyle and wait for the old culture to die off. A higher standard of living would make them more comfortable and more risk-averse. It would take a long time but would eventually catch on. So how Earth is being handled now? Samuel again, but this time with a small smile. Yes, though I don't know how well it's really working. Jemsai stopped to take a sip of his drink. His throat was getting raspy from talking too much, and hearing Stace talk reminded him of the tumbler of alcohol. In Nix's case, Governor Celent wanted results, and she wanted them now. The biggest and most immediate problem was the fact that life expectancy for any Shilvati Marine on the planet that dealt directly with the populace was a month or two at the most. It wasn't insurgence or rebellion. The Nixians seemed remarkably relaxed about the idea of being overseen by the Imperium. The problem was that, no matter how careful they tried to be, a soldier would invariably say or do something that would offend a Nixian's honor. Those long knives would come out and the Marine would be torn apart. Attempts to use crowd control weaponry just resulted in every Nixian in the area swarming from all directions. Impersonal combat is considered the height of dishonor. The same thing occurred whenever attempts were made to disarm them. Eventually the majority of interaction was done with exos, since the only other option was wholesale slaughter of the natives. Dumia Chelza needed to do something, so she immersed herself in Nixian culture, learned everything she could, and realized something important: there was a fundamental difference in the way honor was handled when dealing with juveniles. With adults, a slight to personal honor could be forgiven but rarely was, and a slight to father's honor could not be forgiven at all. It almost always resulted in at least one fatality. Between an adult and a juvenile, however, insults to honor were almost always forgiven and instead used as a teaching moment. Ha! Stace's laugh turned everyone towards him. Your grandmother told them all the Shilvati were children? Distant aunt, but essentially yes. She explained that, compared to the proud Nixian culture that she was rapidly becoming enamored with, the Shilvati Empire was full of children and they needed to be given a child's leniency. This resulted in a dramatic reduction in the amount of Marines getting murdered, though they were now often cornered and lectured about why what they said was inappropriate. Dumia hoped that, with time, she could build a bridge between the Shilvati Imperium and the Nixians that would let them keep being, well, Nixian. It did not go well, and in the aftermath House Elent lost a great deal of power, almost dissolving entirely. They have been gunning for House Chelza ever since. Fire Control Officer Bairi Elsis was not having a good day. She manually adjusted the targeting suite, the massive cruiser servos moving the emitter of the onboard railgun by scant millimeters. At this distance, that was enough for a change of kilometers at the final destination. I think you can go faster than that. The barrel of the pistol bounced off of Bairi's temple, and she dutifully moved faster, zooming in and adjusting. Satellites provided a close view and soon enough she was tracking a signal, one of the only omnipods outside of a purple zone on all of Nyx. Now fire. A searing pain flared in Bairi's left leg, an agony that seemed to go on and on. She looked down and saw a smoking hole at the top of her knee. Bairi was seated and acting Governor Celent had fired the shot through her knee and down the entire length of her lower leg. There was no way she could keep the limb after something like that. Bairi's mind locked with intense pain, tears running down her cheeks. She wanted to put her hands to her face and cry, but the pistol was at her head again. With trembling hands, she pressed the button. A railgun dart designed to take out a large city caught fire as it split the atmosphere, the resulting impact releasing energies that dwarfed a nuclear weapon. All to kill a single member of House Chelza. Bairi did cry then. She had just killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Maybe more. They didn't deserve this. Nobody did. While she sobbed, a hand reached over her shoulder. The control dials spun and the gun slowly moved to a new target. It didn't need the precision of an expert when you were just pointing it at the largest city in the Northern Hemisphere. The acting governess, claiming the title mere moments after the death of her mother, breathed softly into Beary's ear and the pistol pressed against her right knee. Again. The dials moved. Again. The dials moved. Again. Beary shook, waiting for the dials to move again. She couldn't do it anymore. She would rather die. She should have died. The acting governess didn't possess the right credentials to fire the railgun. If Beary wasn't such a coward, millions of Nixians would still be alive. She shook as she sobbed, but the dials didn't move again. The arm reaching over her shoulder was gone. Beary cried out in anguish, face in her hands, full of pain and sorrow and impotent rage. If she had been stronger. A hand gently patted her on the shoulder. A voice, modulated as if through a mask, whispered in her ear. "It's over." Beary tried to turn around, but her damaged leg caught on the floor as the chair turned and everything seemed to go white. When she finally came to her senses, whoever had spoken to her was gone. She was alone aside from the body of former acting governess Tuira Elent, throat neatly slit. After that, the Shilvati Empire decided to wash its hands of Nix. The public didn't know about the contact, they were simply labelled as not economically viable to liberate and left to their own devices. After killing millions. Samuel was shaking, though with rage or anguish Jemsai couldn't tell. Stace's voice broke in. "It's worse than that." His eyes, one hazel and one the black of a Shilvati prosthetic, locked onto Jemsai. There was a rage there, a hot fire that made the Shilvati recoil slightly. An aura of barely restrained violence was practically pouring off the man. "You killed them all. The entire biosphere." "We didn't, House Ellen. That many orbital strikes, all the dust they'd throw up. Nix is a ball of ice at this point. A forced ice age because you couldn't leave people alone." Every word coming out of Stace just reinforced Jemsai's feeling of imminent danger. This was the man Jelsai was dating? He was a monster. Small hands slammed on the table, drawing everyone's attention. Sammy was on their feet, tears streaming down their dark face, green eyes and thick glasses catching the reflected light of the screen. "You wanted a new research project for us? This is it. Nix will have summer again." They took a moment for a sniffle. If anybody there is left alive. End of chapter. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, click the bell so you don't miss any episode and do all the other YouTube stuff. Visit and support the author, and I'll see you next time. If you didn't enjoy, comment on what I can do better. And as usual, have a wonderful day.